Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and good morning. On behalf of the Strategic Vision Institute, I welcome you all at our latest webinar on India's counterforce temptations. We are delighted to have a very distinguished panel of speakers for today's discussion. Now let me introduce you to our worthy speakers. Our first speaker, Dr. Adil Sultan. He is currently the acting dean HOD of the Faculty of Aerospace Sciences and Security Studies at the Air University, Islamabad. Previously, he has worked as Director, Nuclear and Strategic Current Affairs at Center for Aerospace and Security Studies in Islamabad. He works on nuclear arms control, non-proliferation, nuclear strategy, and doctrines, cross-domain deterrence, deterrent stability, and nuclear confidence building measures in South Asia. He is author of the book Universalizing Nuclear Non-Proliferation Norms, a regional framework for South Asian nuclear weapon states. It was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2019. He has written several book chapters, research papers, and has contributed various op-eds in leading Pakistani newspaper on issues related to national security. Dr. Sultan has served in Pakistan Air Force for over 30 years and had worked at Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division for 14 years, where he was Director Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs, and later as Director Research and Analysis at the Policy, Doctrine and Strategy branch of the SPD. He is a former visiting research fellow at the War Studies Center, King College London, International Institute for Strategic Studies London, and Henry L. Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Sultan is also the co-founder of a web portal, Strategic Foresight for Asia, which is a London-based platform publishing policy-relevant analysis on security-related issues. He will be presenting his views on India's evolved strategic thinking and its counterforce temptations. Our second speaker, Dr. Rizwana Abbasi. She is currently serving as Associate Professor and HOD of the Peace and Conflict Studies and International Relations Department at National University of Modern Languages in Islamabad. Previously, she has worked as Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations and Department of Strategic Studies at National Defense University, Islamabad, and Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations at Barrier University, Islamabad. Dr. Abbasi received her PhD from University of Leicester, UK, specializing in international security and nuclear non-proliferation. Dr. Abbasi is a former visiting fellow of Stimson Center, Washington, D.C., and a research fellow at the University of Leeds. Her latest co-authored book entitled Nuclear Deterrence in South Asia, New Technologies and Challenges to Sustainable Peace. It was published by Routledge in 2019. She has also authored a book, Pakistan and the New Nuclear Taboo, Regional Deterrence and International Arms Control Regime. It was published by Peter Lang in 2012. Today, she will be speaking on India's enhanced nuclear capabilities and analysis of counterforce options. Our third speaker, Ambassador retired Zamir Akram. He is currently advisor to the Strategic Plans Division Government of Pakistan. He has served as Pakistan's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva from 2008 till 2015. Previously, he has held various diplomatic assignments in Pakistan's missions abroad. These include Washington, Moscow, New Delhi, and Nepal. He has dealt with key issues including Afghanistan, nuclear non-proliferation, arms control and disarmament, UN reforms, human rights, and counter-terrorism in his career. He holds a master's degree in international relations from London School of Economics and Political Science. He has also served as the honorary dean of the Geneva School of Diplomacy during 2010, where he was awarded an honorary doctorate degree. He will be speaking on political diplomatic dynamics and probability of India's counterforce preemption against Pakistan. Before we proceed further, I would like to mention that this webinar will be conducted in the form of a panel discussion during which each panelist will be given 15 minutes. We request all our worthy panelists to kindly follow this time limit. If anyone is having trouble hearing or viewing the webinar or is having any form of connectivity issue, please do mention this in the chat and we shall try our best to address these issues from our end. Kindly note that by default, mics of all attendees will be on mute and only panelists will be allowed to use mic and video function. If anyone from the audience would like to ask a question, they are requested to kindly use the Q&A option to type out their question. Please do include your name as well as your organizational affiliation along with your question. The questions will then be presented to our panel by the moderator during the questions and answer session accordingly. While we fully encourage you to participate, we request you to please be brief in your questions. We shall try our best to ensure that all questions get answered within our allotted time. We would also request the panelists to kindly respond to the question within 2 minutes. Please further note that all the opinions voiced at the SVI platform are independent opinions of the speakers and the audiences and not the official policy of the SVI. This is an open house activity that will be reported in the media. If anyone would like to tag or post screen grabs of this event on their personal blogs, web pages, or social media, please do not forget to mention that the webinar was organized by the SVI. Thank you very much. Now I invite Dr. Zafar Iqbal Cheema to give his welcome and introductory remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Haris. Thank you very much for a very uh, comprehensive introduction to the distinguished speakers. We have indeed a panel of very learned people to educate us on India's counterforce temptations. I will briefly introduce the subject and then leave it to the specialists to really comment on that. I think since India's nuclear doctrine in August 1999, India has continuously been shifting its nuclear doctrine over a period of time. If we know the original draft nuclear doctrine that was stated or made open by India's National Security Advisor, Rajesh Misra, in August 1999. Only a year before, India and Pakistan has both tested nuclear weapons, and as we call it, the South Asia was nuclearized forever, at least for the moment. It was hardly 2 years have passed that during the Operation Parakaram, around January 23, India has changed its nuclear doctrine from a no first use. It has qualified its no first use that if India is attacked with any chemical, biological, or any such weapon, India reserves the right to use nuclear weapons. And also that if Indian armed forces are attacked anywhere outside India, India also reserves the right to attack with nuclear weapons. I think these were two significant changes which has been made in the Indian nuclear doctrine from what was announced in August 99. Since then, we have seen continuous changes, statements coming from the senior Indian officials like Ajit Doval, like the former Indian National Security Advisor. There have been academicians related to India which have been warning the world about India's changing nuclear doctrine. And there have been semi-official statements coming from India and coming from abroad, which one has to keep into mind that where does India's nuclear doctrine stand today? Is it stand today as it was stated in August 99? Or there are certain changes which have to be kept into mind, keeping into mind the statements which has been made by the officials of India, by academicians, by the international experts, and how this has been interpreted by the various experts at the international level and particularly at the South Asian level. We in Pakistan are particularly concerned with these fluctuations or drifting or shifting, whatever you like to say that, in India's nuclear doctrine, because we are principally affected by India's nuclear posture or India's nuclear doctrine. Pakistan is the first country to be affected, in addition to China being in the region, which are two India's so-called adversaries in this particular field. So from Operation Parakaram onward, eventually, while India has operationalized a part of its nuclear doctrine in January 2003, we have seen continuous changes in the Indian nuclear doctrine. I think there have been many, many statements and many changes, and it would not be possible for me to recount all that given the short time of 10 minutes that I have been given to introduce the subject. But I think an significant statements came in 2016, one by Vipan Narayan, who is an Indian origin academician. He is an American citizen, I believe, but I'm not very sure about that. So let's not call him an Indian. Let's call him an Indian ethnically oriented specialist. His statement, which he made at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace conference, is very enlightening, is very educative, is very alarming from Pakistan's point of view. That India will not allow Pakistan to, as per its policy, to first use of nuclear weapons. The statement that he has used will be, I hope, repeated by the panelists, by the distinguished panelists. I do not remember all verbally the statement that he had made it. But the gist of that statement is that India is not going to allow Pakistan to first attack it with nuclear weapons, and it would carry out a splendid first strike itself on the Pakistani nuclear weapons and nuclear assets, and that would be a kind of a preemptive attack. If India feels that Pakistan is in a conflict situation, is preparing to deploy its nuclear weapons, India might attack Pakistan first and not allow it the option of first use. The second statement, which in a book form came from the India's national advisor, I'm forgetting his name, forgive me for that. And he states in a book again the same thing, that India has considered it many times that Pakistan should not be allowed to have a first use of nuclear weapons. Since then, as the honorable panelists know that very well, they are the subject specialists, that Indian authors, Indian officials, Indians have made many statements that we have, and there's an ambiguity, frankly speaking, and in my opinion.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
I said there is an ambiguity coming from India, and to my opinion, the ambiguity is deliberate. At times they say we will adhere to no first use option, which we declared in August 1999. And at times they make statement that there is no more use, there's no more being used, and India will do what it would like to do that. So I think that that ambiguity, in my opinion, is deliberately being created by India. It's saying we will have a no use, no first use, and it says we can have a right to use nuclear weapons first. So I think the subject would become clarify if the participants are. I'm very grateful to the participants also joining us, and I would like some better question on this very subject. But I believe we should be patient till the subject specialists who we have invited are kindly be able to deal with their subject and take the time which they have taken. And then onward, we will deliberate this subject, whether India's nuclear doctrine stands where it was in August 99, or there are certain changes in which, and how those changes affect the international community, if at all it does, and how does it affect Pakistan, particularly from our point of view. So I now request Haris, I give it back to Haris the floor to kindly invite the distinguished panelists one by one in the forum that he has spoken. Thank you very much, Haris.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I invite Dr. Adil Sultan to speak on India's evolved strategic thinking and its counterforce temptations. Dr. Adil Sultan, sir.
Thank you very much, Haris, and thank you, Dr. Cheema, for providing this opportunity to discuss this important issue. And why this is important, I always appreciate the efforts of Strategic Vision Institute, because in this COVID-19 environment and ongoing international developments and regional developments, the focus on ceasefire and the LOC, people tend to forget what India actually is doing in terms of its military capability and doctrinal developments. So SVI is playing an important role in creating that awareness about India's development. For example, today the news that we read about, India is buying about 30 Predators drones from the United States. So this is an important development which could affect India's doctrinal thinking also, or it could provide incentive for India to launch maybe aerial surgical strike by using these drones against Pakistan, and this would have an impact on strategic stability in South Asia. So in my brief remarks, I'll cover 4 aspects. just give you a brief history of evolving strategic thought in India, evolved or evolving as you might say. The military development, especially after nuclearization, that is impacting India's doctrinal developments, and the four factors primarily that indicate that India is probably moving towards counterforce doctrine. And I'll just enlist in the end options for Pakistan. I'll not go in detail because I believe other colleagues would also have some things to say about these issues. So coming to this evolving or the evolved strategic doctrine, strategic thinking in India, one point is clear from the start, it has been prestige driven. India wants to be recognized as a major power globally, and whatever it is developing in terms of its military capability or doctrinal developments, it is intended to enhance India's stature. The rivalry with China that provides justification for India to dehyphenate its security question from Pakistan and hyphenate with China and see the emerging security environment as India-China dyad and not as India-Pakistan dyad. So that's what their thinking appears to be. Okay, there's a comment. Haris, am I loud and clear? Because somebody said my voice is echoing, it's not clear.
सर आपकी आवाज क्लियर आ रही है लेकिन थोड़ा सा इको आ रहा है. I don't know why.
Yes, so long. So I just moved the speakers away. Maybe it is better now. So I was talking about this rivalry with China. The growing distrust between United States and China, it also helps India to exploit this rivalry for its own political and military advantage by arguing its case that India could be a potential bulwark against China if it is helped militarily by the external powers, especially the United States. And ironically, many of the Western powers, they are buying this idea and they are helping India militarily and also supporting in terms of political objectives also. But we have to be very clear that India and China are never going to fight a war. So they have so much at stake in terms of economics. They have more than $90 billion of bilateral trade. So India is never going to fight, but this illusion that India can probably stand up against China, that is being played at the international level. And Quad is one recent example which has negates the remaining illusion, if there was any, about India's non-alignment. So at best we can say what Shankar in his recent book is saying, this is what India's way of dealing with the international world, the India way of strategizing. So I'll just also refer to Dr. Cheema's remarks earlier about India's doctrinal dispersions, as one can say, because they have their own way of interpretation of different strategic jargons, how to use their nuclear capability globally as well as at the regional level. So that's the way, Indian way, we can say. Before I move forward, I think it's important that we should understand from where the genesis of strategic thought in India. Soon after independence, this bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that had a deep impact on Nehru and the political leadership, who saw nuclear weapons as a great equalizer, that if India has to emerge as a major power globally, eventually India must pursue nuclear weapons capability. And that is how we saw that India continued to progress on this dual-track nuclear program while not admitting publicly that it is building nuclear weapons. China was never an existential threat for India. In fact, during that time in 50s, China-India relations were very cordial and friendly. So China never posed that kind of threat which could have provided an incentive to build its nuclear program. And we also recall from the statement by Homi Bhabha, who is father of India's nuclear program in 1958, that India can potentially build a bomb within few months if political leadership gives a word. So you can make out from this that India from the very start had this ambition to build nuclear program because of prestige factor and absent any serious or legitimate security threat to India. That is why 1974 test was termed as peaceful nuclear explosion, because India could not justify any threat to its security. It took another 24 years for India to come out of the closet and declare formally itself as a nuclear weapon state in 1998. So the statement that came out after 1998 from India was that India is a nuclear weapon state and it must be recognized as such. So this now, if you can see what is happening now and how India wants to be treated at par with other major powers, so that thought publicly came out in 1998 soon after nuclearization. And this thinking became the basis of future negotiations with the rest of the world, especially the United States, and became the core of India-US strategic partnership and India-US nuclear deal, where India wanted to be seen and treated at par with other major powers. And in the joint statement of July 18, 2005, and India argued that it should be treated at par with other countries, such as the United States. So that was the thinking that came out in 2005, that India wants to be treated equally at par with other superpowers, major powers, especially the United States. Now, coming briefly to military dimensions, if we say the 1998 test helped both India to formally declare themselves as nuclear weapon state, but it also proved to be counterproductive in terms of military balance, because this helped Pakistan to restore equilibrium in this part of the world in South Asia, which made it difficult for India to use its conventional military advantage against Pakistan for limited political objectives or to wage a war against Pakistan. So to deal with this, what Dr. Cheema also briefly alluded, that India introduced the Gold Star Doctrine in 2004. The whole objective of the Gold Star Doctrine was to create or explore space to fight a limited war while remaining below Pakistan's perceived strategic threshold. Perceived, I say, because this is what India perceived, that if they indulge in a limited nuclear war, probably it will not push Pakistan to cross its nuclear threshold, and they would be able to achieve some limited military objectives. But in response, Pakistan came out with its full spectrum deterrence that was intended to rule out possibility of any military conflict ranging from a limited to an all-out war. So that neutralized India's Gold Star Doctrine. Frustrated by these military developments in South Asia, India then came up with the Surgical Strike Doctrine in 2016 and claimed that it had launched a surgical strike against LOC in Pakistani administered Kashmir. Pakistan did not respond because it believed nothing happened, so there is no need to respond. But in hindsight, several observers are saying even if India had not conducted a surgical strike, Pakistan should have responded, and this could have preempted or reduced the incentive for India to launch aerial surgical strike, which it did in 2019. Probably lack of action from the Pakistani side in 2016 encouraged or emboldened Modi to launch aerial surgical strike in 2019, and we all saw what happened in 2019. This surgical strike doctrine also has been discredited because Pakistan was able to shoot down 2 of the Indian aircraft, and India could not use it for political gains or to assert its military dominance over Pakistan. So following that, and the recent story, if we see from Hindustan Times and the Reuters also, this validated that during 2019 crisis, India did mobilize its missiles also. So Modi had that intent to launch missiles against Pakistan. So that was a dangerous development, but it also indicates the mindset of the political leadership in India. So if you gel it with the doctrinal developments or the dispersions deliberately created by the Indian elite in India's doctrine to build a case for counterforce strikes against Pakistan. So this was first evidence where the Indian political leadership mobilized their missiles. So the 4 elements that I would briefly allude to, I know I'm sensitive to time also, so I'm left with 5 minutes, so I'll briefly cover these. Dr. Cheema has already talked about no first use controversy. It was never a clean no first use, but India has always been using it politically to tell to the rest of the international community that it is a responsible country and it follows no first use, and its neighbor is not as responsible and they do not subscribe to no first use policy. But that's their way of interpretation of this no first use. We know that 2003 doctrine, it was with a caveat, like Dr. Cheema said, that India retains the right to use nuclear weapons in response to chemical and biological weapons, which in fact violates its own no first use commitment. But more importantly, since 2016, we have seen number of senior decision makers, especially members from the Nuclear Command Authority, India's Nuclear Command Authority, and their commander of India's General P.S. Nagal, and then Shiv Shankar in his book Choices, that there could be circumstance for a preemptive first strike against Pakistan. So that was the first indicator publicly from a very senior former official that indicated the ongoing thinking amongst India's strategic elite. So this no first use, with which India takes pain to explain to the rest of the international community that it is a very responsible country, but a number of India's former defense minister, the current defense minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh, and former national security advisor, all these people are part of the National Nuclear Command Authority. So they have been doubting their own nuclear policy. So that is a way of creating or opening space for that dispersion where India can justify in future to use its nuclear weapons first against Pakistan in a preemptive strike. The second element that we see is the development of BMD capability. BMD capability between India and Pakistan is not going to work, but it can lead to a false sense of security amongst India's decision maker and could provide an incentive for a first strike. Then third is second strike capability, again with the same logic. But most importantly, the developments which have come up recently is the hypersonic weapons. The hypersonic weapons, because of the speed and precisions, are considered to be more effective against short-range ballistic missiles or missiles that are deployed on mobile launches, such as Pakistan's short-range ballistic missiles Nasr. So this Nasr has been playing a very important role in deterring India's cold start doctrine. So possibly India would be employing these hypersonic weapons or developing these weapons as a deterrent to deter Pakistan from early deployment of these weapons and then create space for limited war fighting against Pakistan. So this is disturbing because it can lead to miscalculation and Pakistan would be definitely forced to take remedial measures. So before I conclude, I just list some of the options that Pakistan could utilize, and I'll leave the rest to the question and answer session. Pakistan can also develop hypersonic weapons, but it's very costly and is not going to be effective. It could review its full spectrum deterrence, committing to retaliate massively against any preemptive strike, conventional or nuclear, against Pakistan. Third, it can increase the numbers and mobility of its short-range ballistic missiles and also move towards operationalizing and developing and operationalizing of its second strike capability. So these are some of the options. So I'm still left with 15 seconds, but I'll leave for now, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are during question and answer session. Thank you, Haris.
Thank you so much, sir, for your excellent presentation. Now I invite Dr. Rizwana Karim Abbasi. She will speak on India's enhanced nuclear capabilities and analysis of counterforce options. Over to you, ma'am.
Can you hear me, Haris?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much, Haris. Viewers, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and good morning. First of all, I'm grateful to SVI for giving me this platform. As you have asked me to talk about and cover ground on India's growing nuclear capabilities, that probably would lead to determine transformation in its nuclear doctrinal posture. So I would like to say that, as you all know, that since 1998, India has been testing its no first use policy. And however, nature of India's evolving doctrine, its transforming postures and capabilities belie the lofty Indian recent claims. For example, I would say that in fact, statements by several Indian famous officials, as was highlighted by Dr. Adil Sultan, that Shiv Shankar Memon points towards a serious debate in the Indian officialdom about review of its no first use policy. And many international reputed scholars and observers like Vipin Naran and Christophe Clary have referred to Indian counterforce temptations too. The above developments and growing debate is not a, I would say, surprise for Pakistan. As we have always taken the Indian no first use policy as a bluff and gimmick. Indian disbelief in nuclear policy can be determined from the fact that India never accepted Chinese no first use commitments and kept on developing and modernizing its own nuclear deterrence in parallel. So if there was any doubt left regarding the Indian bluff of no first use, the same was clarified during the 2019 post Pulwama event, during and of course in the post 2019 post Pulwama event. So Modi's particularly statements such as nuclear weapons utility not for Diwali and his statements such as Qatal ki Raat, threats to Pakistan was yet again an evidence of glaring contradictions between Indian political policy statements on the one hand and their actual behavior on the other hand. So question then arises, what are the factors that shape policy shift in India? So I believe that these include the growing Indian confidence in its misperceived military advantage against Pakistan, the perceived edge which India is supposed to acquire by virtue of new and emerging technologies, and India's illusion that at the political level, its narrative of being justified is, in taking action against Pakistan is acceptable on the false premise of terrorism. Among the technologies which, facilitate Indian pursuit of misguided strategies are the space technologies, which certainly provide precise data about grain locations of adversaries' assets. In parallel to the developments I highlighted above, I think as was highlighted by Adil Sultan as well, hypersonic delivery systems which reduce response time and evade enemies' air defenses is another development. Indian induction of anti-ballistic missile defense systems, including Russian S-400s, seems to provide false sense of security to India to attempt a misadventure against Pakistan. So India is also reputed to be developing MOV technologies, which are intended more for, I would say, counterforce than counter-value targets. So all these developments are being aided and abetted by assumptions and exceptions granted to India in terms of access to advanced military technologies and dual-use systems. So the US has certainly granted strategic trade authorization STA1 level status to India, which allows India to purchase advanced military items without individual licenses. So several foundational agreements aimed at enhancing the interoperability of the US and Indian forces include the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement for Geospatial Cooperation, such as BECA. So these sort of developments and agreements certainly would lead to enhance Indian military strike precision capabilities. And the option at this stage for Pakistan in the course of, I would say these Indian developments will be to develop its own capabilities to counter Indian designs. So in short, the Indian temptation, which is very hard to materialize at a practical level, is undermining broader strategic stability of this region, thereby increasing nuclear risks and generating fueling a new sort of arms race. So yet it is still, and it still fails to provide any assurances to India, of any success in its, designs or malign, option that it adopts. So the Indian planning, I would say, of dominating a two-front conflict with Pakistan and China, whereby it can neutralize Pakistan early in the conflict while maintaining a credible deterrence against China, is a pipe dream, I would say. So the sooner India sheds such illusions, the better it would be for both India and regional and global peace and stability. So I would like to say and I would like to conclude by saying that both the countries in South Asia will have to, one way or the other, return to dialogue on promoting risk reduction, avoidance of this intense arm race, and promote restraint and adopt CBMs. That is the only way forward. So I think with this note, I would like to stop here, and I'm open for interactive. I'm open to take questions during the interactive section for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rizwana, for your excellent presentation. Now I invite Ambassador Zamir Akram. He will speak on political diplomatic dynamics and the probability of India's counterforce preemption against Pakistan. Ambassador Zamir Akram, sir.
Thank you very much. First of all, I appreciate being invited to participate in this very important webinar. A lot of what I was going to say has been stated already. That's because of the interrelated nature of this topic. So I would ask you to forgive me for any repetition, which is inevitable. But let me trying to focus on the political and diplomatic dynamics and the probability of India's counterforce preemption, which is my topic. I want to begin actually from 1998, after the Indian and Pakistani nuclear tests, following which there was hectic activity between Pakistan and India at the diplomatic and political levels, as well as a role by the major powers, in particular the United States, with which both sides also interacted. So in this political and diplomatic background, the first and important thing that we need to recall is that Pakistan and India engaged in a comprehensive composite dialogue process in which the issue of peace and security was one of the agenda items, and that essentially meant dealing with our the outcome of our nuclear tests, and to manage strategic stability in the region. Now, as you will all know, one of the major proposals that Pakistan made at the time to India was this issue of a strategic restraint regime, which called for restraint and abstinence from developing technologies that would be further destabilizing. Among these was technologies for ballistic missile defense or for a submarine launched ballistic missile capability that would be destabilizing, among several other factors. At that time also, the Indians were reluctant to engage with us on such a nuclear restraint regime, strategic restraint regime, but were willing only to make progress on some confidence building measures, which, as you all know, are mentioned in the Lahore Declaration between the two countries. But in real terms, on the substantive issues, there was no real progress to ensure strategic stability. And we'd also discussed during those meetings the various strategic doctrines. The Indian doctrine, as has been mentioned, the draft in nuclear doctrine, talked about or claimed to talk about an Indian commitment not to be the first to use nuclear weapons. And there was pressure on Pakistan from the US and from other countries that Pakistan should also accept such a no first use capability. From Pakistan's perspective, of course, India's no first use was not a reliable commitment, and statements by Indian leaders themselves indicated that they were not really fully committed to this objective. And has been explained by previous speakers, various other conditionalities have been introduced, which make this commitment very unreliable, to say the least. But the important thing is that the nuclear tests actually neutralized India's major advantage against Pakistan, which was its numerical superiority or advantage over Pakistan in terms of conventional weapons capabilities. This Indians themselves realized and publicly stated from the very of this consequence of the nuclear tests. As a result of these nuclear tests, the neutralization of India's conventional superiority was an issue that the Indian military in particular was very keen to rectify. This eventually led to the enunciation of the cold start doctrine in about 2004, 2005, which the Indians initially denied, but then recently their Army Chief General Bipin Rawat has acknowledged this. But from the very beginning, we were cognizant of the implications of cold start, which was that the Indians were seeking to be able to launch a limited attack against Pakistan below in what they considered was Pakistan's nuclear threshold. This had been clear even at the end of the Kargil crisis, when George Fernandez, the then defense minister, had claimed that that despite the existence of nuclear deterrence, conventional war below the nuclear threshold was still possible. And this issue of the cold start doctrine then persuaded Pakistan to respond. And by about 2011, we had the technological capability with the development of low-yield nuclear weapons, plus the development of short-range Nasr missile, to be able to deploy what has wrongly, in my view, been called as tactical nuclear weapons. Actually, these are low-yield nuclear weapons that can be used in a battlefield condition or so. This enabled Pakistan to enunciate its full spectrum deterrence policy, which enabled deterrence at the three levels: operational, tactical, and strategic levels. These developments are important in the lead up to what we are going to be discussing today. But before I come to that point, the important thing from the diplomatic side was that while the dialogue between India and Pakistan had by this time become dormant and still remains dormant, for a considerable period of time, there were almost about 9 rounds of talks between Pakistan and the United States, in which the so-called security, strategic stability and non-proliferation, or SSNP talks, in which the US real objective was, of course, to convince Pakistan not to object to the start of FMCT negotiations in the Conference on Disarmament. But as a part of these talks, they were also trying to put pressure on Pakistan to demonstrate so-called restraint in the development of its strategic capabilities. In particular, they wanted that we should not develop what they termed as tactical nuclear weapons. They raised concerns about the Nasr lowering the nuclear threshold. And they also talked about the safety and security and the command and control of these weapons. Unfortunately, however, while these kind of demands were being made towards Pakistan, the US was not inclined to engage in any such demands for restraint by India. On the contrary, we saw that particularly during the Bush administration, global developments plus the growing hostility between the United States and China over the years led to the Americans opening the door for civilian nuclear cooperation with India, the waiver, etc., you know all that, which brought about a qualitative change in the American-Indian strategic relationship. And that has progressed over the years since the Bush administration to the present time, in which the relationship is now a part of a very close strategic partnership based on the so-called 4 foundational agreements, and access to latest weapons technologies, highly encrypted intelligence data, as well as under BECA, the targeting of the opposition's assets. So all of this has enhanced India's strategic capabilities tremendously and in a qualitatively different way. While this is meant to help India against China as part of the so-called quadrilateral alliance, the fact remains that these development of these Indian capabilities also affects Pakistan. So coming to the real issue of our discussion today, which is India's counterforce temptations. First, let me say that when we talk about counterforce temptations, and I know that Christopher Clary and Vipin Narang have spoken to them, spoken about so-called counterforce temptations, but from our point of view, we should not distinguish. In fact, there can be no real clear-cut distinction between what are counterforce and what are counter value targeting. Sometimes the line is very blurred, sometimes it's the same thing, and depends who is looking at the issue. So we need to really talk about India's attempts towards attaining the capability for a so-called splendid or disarming first preemptive first strike. What this means is the ability to be able to destroy all of Pakistan's nuclear assets, potentially to destroy all of Pakistan's nuclear assets, and retain the capability to blunt any Pakistani response from any residual capability that it may have. And so this brings into the whole debate, questioning of India's so-called no first use commitment. And it has been already pointed out that people like Shiv Shankar Menon in his book Choices, B.S. Nagal, the former head of Indian Strategic Forces, the former Indian Defense Minister Manohar Parrikar, and even the recent, the current Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh, even I would say Prime Minister Vajpayee after the standoff in 2001-2002 have all put into question this whole commitment to no first use. In fact, Shiv Shankar Menon argues that there is considerable room within India's doctrine for a first strike if the Indians come to the conclusion that Pakistan is developing or putting in place its nuclear weapons in response to a cold start type of attack, and that India could go first. And this has also been highlighted by Vipin Narang, among other people. Now, how are they going to do this? And how is it possible for the Indians to be able to put into effect such a preemptive first strike capability? I think one of the several technological developments point towards the operationalization of such a preemptive first strike. They have acquired a effective operational triad of delivery systems, land, air, and sea-based capabilities. They have a submarine-based second strike capability and recently conducted a deterrence patrol. They are building a ballistic missile defense system based on Russian, American, Israeli, and Indian systems. They are also experimenting, developing MIRV missile capabilities, cruise missiles, supersonic and hypersonic missiles, which has been mentioned, the BrahMos. Most importantly, they have developed a splendid or disarming preemptive first strike against Pakistan to destroy its nuclear assets and to use the ballistic missile defense and other capabilities to blunt any Pakistani response by its residual weapons. Is it possible? I don't think so. But the Indians are not stupid enough to think that it is possible either. So what really is their intention? What is their real rationale? And in my personal view, I think the real rationale is to be able to have the potential to threaten Pakistan with such a preemptive disarming first strike in the hope, in the calculation that Pakistan would be dissuaded to use its low-yield nuclear weapons in the event of an Indian limited conventional attack under Cold Start. So it is, in effect, an attempt to reassert, to reestablish the salience of India's option to conduct a limited conventional war. But reality is different from what they are trying to or would like to achieve. And this, in a very limited and a very short duration, was demonstrated during the February 2019 crisis, when we saw that, let alone resorting to any kind of major offensive against Pakistan, not even the idea of Cold Start was initiated by the Indian side. And the one lesson that can come out of that crisis is that nuclear deterrence remains in place. However, given the fact that deterrence is dynamic and the fact that the Indians are developing major capabilities that I mentioned, there is obviously a need for Pakistan to take measures for its own security to ensure credible deterrence in the future. And so, to conclude, I have, in my own view, I would share what we need to do. I think we are already doing a lot of this anyway. But I think first and foremost, it would be necessary to enhance the safety and security of our nuclear assets, as well as the command and control systems. Secondly, we need to increase the capability to be able to penetrate India's BMD. And I think this, to a large extent, is already a capability that we have through the development of cruise missiles and MIRV missiles. We also need to be able to develop a more effective and more credible second strike capability, especially one that is sea-based and used, particularly if it is using submarines, if it is submarine-based. Then we need to acquire longer range missiles. We know that the Shaheen missile series is there, but we need to be able to have MIRV Shaheen missiles if possible, so that we are able to cover all of Indian territory, including its offshore assets, its islands, such as Andaman and Nicobar. we need to develop an anti-satellite weapons capability, an ASAT capability, just as the Indians have done, because in the future of warfare requires a very heavy dependence on the surveillance, the reconnaissance, the targeting, the whole range of issues that are going to be increasingly space-based and using satellite technologies. Since the Indians already have this capability, this is a qualitative change, and we need to equalize that in the future. We also need to invest in new warfare technologies, given the fact that we have economic limitations, but still we need to be aware that going forward, new technologies such as cyber and artificial intelligence will increasingly come into play. And we can talk about how cyber affects even deterrence. The credibility of deterrence can be corrupted through cyber warfare. So I think these are new areas where in the future we need to invest in. And of course, we need to upgrade and continue to maintain a qualitative edge in our conventional capabilities through the weapon systems, plus through our own training, which again has demonstrated during this short, brief crisis, technologically our conventional capabilities proved to be more effective. So we need to focus on all these areas in order to send the message to the Indians that any attempt or even any consideration of a disarming preemptive first strike against Pakistan remains a futile exercise for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Zamir, Akram, for such a comprehensive presentation. Now it's time for the question and answer session. Dr. Cheema, if you allow, can I start the question and answer session, please?
I think I would first like to appreciate that all the three speakers, the panelists, have made very comprehensive, very learning, very educative presentations, especially at the end by Ambassador Zamir Akram. This makes absolutely clear to our neighbors in India that if they think of any such thing, Pakistan is well prepared for that. And whatever deficiencies maybe in future, we would like to be prepared for that. I think that's a very important message which should go out of this webinar and should come into mind. I will now request you to kindly conduct the question and answer session. We would like to exhaust as many questions as possible.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. The first question is from Mr. Iftikhar Ali. He is assistant professor at Akram International University, Gilgit. The question is not addressed to any specific speaker. He's saying that the question is open. Anyone from the panelists can respond to this question. Does India, yes, sir, does India indeed have a counterforce strategy, or it is only facing temptation? Does India have sufficient technological and organizational structure to successfully implement such a drastic change in its nuclear strategy? If so, would it make sense for decision makers on one side to opt for any counterforce first strike when they know that other has a secured second strike capability?
Since he has not specified any speaker to answer this question, may I request Ambassador Zamir Akram to kindly answer this question?
I think that as of today, as of now, India does not have that kind of capability. This was acknowledged by Vipin Narang himself, who is one of the leading proponents of this Indian position when he made this statement in the Carnegie meeting in Washington a few years ago, that India is not there yet. However, the fact is that the capabilities that are being developed, and some that have already been developed, certainly point in the direction of having the ability to launch a preemptive first strike. Whether that will be sufficient to prevent any retaliation, that certainly is not the case, at least in my reading. So it would be a foolhardy thing to do for India in the first place. But as I said in my presentation, the idea is not to actually launch preemptive first strike. Indians are not stupid. They know that even they are not willing to take that kind of risk of even one nuclear weapon landing on Bombay or New Delhi. But I think what they want to do is to be able to demonstrate that they can, if they want to, that they have the capability, potential capability to launch a preemptive first strike in the hope that this will convince Pakistan not to use its low-yield nuclear weapons in the case of an Indian limited conventional attack. So that's the cause and effect kind of approach that they're thinking is likely going in this direction. Otherwise, it makes no sense to me for anyone to think, not even the US at the height of the Cold War could have imagined launching a preemptive first strike and getting away with it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can I very precisely add to what Zamir Akram said? I think I 100% agree with what Zamir Akram has precisely said, and he has summed up beautifully. I think I would just very precisely say that India is quite ambitious in order to achieve its goals. Number one, of course, India has achieved somehow its desirable second strike capability. Secondly, they have been given privilege to, and access to the international market. And they are procuring such technologies in order to achieve nuclear supremacy in this particular region. So practically, yes, they are on its way, and they are trying to achieve that sort of capability, but also trying to increase its accuracy and effectiveness of its inventory. But at the same time, I think the concluding point and takeaway from today's discussion would be that why India is trying to achieve, counterforce capability was beautifully summed up by Zamir Akram, because they are on a disadvantageous position currently against, Pakistan's low-yield weapon, and they are trying to minimize that gap. So in order to minimize that gap, they are trying to destabilize deterrence. So in order to achieve and in order to maintain peace, they are trying to end their talk of fighting wars under the nuclear overhang. I think that is a dangerous move. And internationally, this sort of move, this sort of behavior, these sort of actions are totally not acceptable. These are dangerous actions, and these actions lead to exploit peace, not only between the two countries, but in the entire region, which will have far-reaching impact beyond this region. Thank you.
Please, next.
Yes, sir. The next question is from Ms. Sherbano, research affiliate at the SVI. Her question is addressed to Dr. Adil Sultan. As India is moving from its initial nuclear doctrine towards war fighting, counterforce, preemptive, and disarming first strike posture against Pakistan, is Pakistan's current nuclear capability enough to deter Indian designs against Pakistan? Dr. Adil Sultan.
Yeah, thank you for this question. In short, yes. Because once we talk about nuclear deterrence, numbers do not matter. But as student of strategic studies, we also know that deterrence is a psychological phenomenon. And if there is a large degree of disparity in numbers, both quality also, it could provide incentive to the other side, which has advantage to test some of the options which we are discussing over here on the Indian side. So for now, Pakistan has enough and sufficient credible deterrence against India. That is why India is continuously contemplating new doctrines, trying new thoughts, and developing new options. So this also refers to something I would want to bring to the previous question, that capabilities Yes, intent can change anytime. So we are not talking about whether India has a present counterforce strategy or not. What we are discussing today is the way India is building its military capability, both nuclear and conventional. The intent can change anytime. Nobody ever imagined that Prime Minister Modi would order mobilization of its dual-capable Prithvi missiles against Pakistan during 2019 crisis, but it happened. So what is the guarantee that this similar kind of political leadership in future, given this false perception by the DRDO and the military that they can take on Pakistan, they can go on this adventurism. I would also refer to what this professor from Karim University, Professor Zafar, asked about this. We also need to understand that nuclear learning trajectory in both India and Pakistan is different. India sees nuclear capability as a matter of prestige, and that is why their military, they continue to develop war-fighting doctrine, conventional military doctrine, without taking into consideration that this region is nuclearized and any war, or even a limited war, can quickly escalate to an all-out war and possibly to a nuclear exchange. But they do not take this into consideration. That's why this thinking is more dangerous in India. Their scientific establishment, they continue to develop solutions for unspecified threat. ICBM, they do not matter for China. It goes to other continents while they are building those ICBMs. ASAT capability, like Ambassador Zamir Akram said, most of this military capability is likely to be used potentially against Pakistan, but having this capability, the intent can always change. So this nuclear learning curve in both India and Pakistan, we need to understand, and only then we can draw our own conclusion, not depending upon what Vipin Naran or Chris Clary, they're outsiders. Our analysis are based on the threat perceptions as we perceive, as we see Indian capabilities, and as we see our own capabilities and the doctrinal developments. I think that is what matters. One point about this came about whether India has operationalized nuclear capability or not. One of the Indian senior naval commander who was head of India's Strategic Force Command, he wrote a book. There's no concept of operationalization of nuclear capability in India as of now. Reason? Because they have not integrated nuclear capability into its military doctrine, war-fighting doctrine. And he gave the example that the DRDO, it wants to maintain its primacy and keeps the delivery systems in its own hand. The Atomic Energy Commission, they have the warheads, and the military, which are the end users, are never integrated into decision making. So once we talk about operationalization of nuclear capability, unless you have integrated and you have practiced and into the overall military doctrine, these capabilities cannot be termed as operationalization. But India is flaunting its potential, its future potential also. Again, what Ambassador Zamir said, and I fully agree, also alluded to those remarks, it is all about prestige, that India wants to be seen as a major power in its own entire nuclear capability, without understanding the consequences of this nuclear capability on India-Pakistan dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Ms. Adil Ahmed. She's a research fellow at PICS, Islamabad. The question is addressed to Dr. Rizwana Abbasi. Please enlighten us that is a warfare in South Asia, or it is the social determinism?
That's a very significant question. I think, I believe it's the technology that leads the system and that leads politics, and that, of course, I'm actually talking about in the global context. I actually also teach my students there are certain determining factors that determine global shift in the order, and within those determining factors, one particular factor is technology that drives the system. And I strongly believe that globally technology is the determining factor that has transformed the nature and dynamics of war. So if I relate the same argument to South Asia, I believe that this is a technological, again, shift that has transformed the system in South Asia and transformed the nature and the character of conflict between India and Pakistan. From the outset, if you see that how war theater actually was sort of, there was different nature of this war theater between India and Pakistan pre-1998 era, and particularly arrival of an introduction of nuclear weapon in this conflicting dynamic has completely shifted the nature and character of war. But with the passage of time, the nature and character of war completely transformed, and it has, it has got shrink to a level where we think that no longer the two states want to fight bigger war. Two states do not want to, escalate a war to in terms of territory, in terms of employment of force, or in terms of employment of technology. But in the contemporary times, after, of course, 2 decades of induction of nuclear weapons in our inventory, we have seen further shift, in smarter, this is era of precision. This is era of smart wars. And in these smart wars, states globally are trying to achieve their precise, short, crisp, type of, goals without, escalating the conflict to the civilian domain. So they're trying to minimize collateral damage. So that sort of shift, I think India has trying to, absorb. But practically, it is very difficult for the two countries to achieve, in South Asia, to achieve that sort of capability. They are on its way. They're trying to achieve that capability to make short, crisp, precise, smart, but at the same time, without, escalating war to a level, there is huge level of collateral damage, but to achieve swift goals and, objectives. I think that is something which India is trying to achieve. But again, as Zamir Akram summed up, that it is very difficult, in this particular context in South Asia to achieve that set of goals, because of course, technology is still nascent. They are trying to, achieve that set of level, but it will take time. But before they take time, then again, Pakistan is also keeping an eye on new technologies. So Pakistan is also keeping and trying to minimize that sort of gap that they try creating in deterrent capability in South Asia. So I think I would sum up saying that it's technology that drives the system and politics.
The next question, basically, these are 2 questions raised by Ms. Saima Mantial, senior researcher at SIS. One question is addressed to Dr. Adil and the other is addressed to Dr. Rizwana. Question number 1. How would the emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and automation affect the Indian capability to operationalize the so-called disarming or preemptive first strike? What capabilities would aid India in undertaking preemption, and what kind of AI-based capabilities on the Pakistani side would help balance the technological edge? The second question to Dr. Rizwana Abbasi. How do you analyze India's move to deploy an assured second strike platform, INS Arihant, early in the Pulwama Balakot crisis, threat of use of dual-use cruise missiles? And does it indicate anything about a possible change in Indian strategy already in the process of being implemented?
Okay. Thank you for this question, Ms. Saima, about this impact of AI on India's operationalization of its capability and on Pakistan's remedial measures. First of all, we have to understand that this debate of emerging technologies on nuclear deterrence is relatively new, and the entire international community and scholars, they are grappling with these challenges, trying to understand what kind of implications these new technologies have. For now, we know that AI can help in quick assessments, bringing out analysis, and that's it. And we're talking about the countries which are pretty advanced in these kind of technologies. And this concept of cross-domain deterrence, where the emerging technologies can play that role or affect adversely the adversary's equation. So that's the debate, ongoing debate. India and Pakistan, for now, are far off from this. At best, what they can do is they can complicate the decision-making process by launching cyber attack against Pakistan. But then we have to see how robust Pakistan has how robust is command and control over Pakistan's side, because as we see the statements that have been given over the last many years by the NCA, there are multiple firewalls to cater for these kind of contingencies, to provide that redundancy in command and control, and to ensure that the cyber attacks or these kind of attacks do not hamper the decision-making process. And I believe that is the case. But in future, the AI can definitely assist in providing quick assessment of different contingencies. In terms of nuclear weapons, I don't think so. Any of the nuclear weapon state would be trusted to give this entire decision-making process to artificial intelligence, subject this decision-making process to robots, because in deterrence, human factor is the most important variable, and that enhances or degrades the deterrence value of any state. So that's, I think it has limitations also. It can aid in quick assessment analysis, but not in terms of enhancing the effectiveness of weapons or anything of that sort for now, as we know the technologies up till now. Thank you.
Dr. Rizwana.
Haris, hello.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So can you, Haris, repeat the question that you just raised regarding Balakot and naval capability deployed by India?
How do you analyze India's move to deploy an assured second strike platform early in the Pulwama-Balakot crisis, threat of use of dual-use cruise missiles, and does it indicate anything about a possible change in India's strategy already in the process of being implemented?
Very precisely, I would say yes. The question is that because they took practical move. One, they tried to deploy their air and naval capability at a time. They practically deployed air capability against Pakistan, but at the same time, they tried operationalized and mobilized their naval capability in parallel. I think the purpose was one, to test Pakistan's resolve. Number two, to destabilize deterrence in order to achieve their swift and quick goals. Three, I think to test and to check their own capability on ground. So I think they have received a response, and the world knows the kind of response that they have received. But at the same time, these sort of moves, I would say, are kind of new moves in South Asia, because up till this date, we have not experienced and we have not witnessed such sort of moves globally between two nuclear weapon states. So in a way, that is sort of new learning lesson as to how and what the two countries wanted to achieve, and why India mobilized it in that direction, and why international community did not take action, why there was no sort of dominant debate on the sort of move, particularly deploying naval and air capability at a time, and mobilizing, of course, is naval operationalizing and mobilizing naval capability at a time. So that, I think that is the question, that is the gap which we need to really address, as to how and what sort of conflict dynamics are we going to experience in the near future, what sort of moves India aims and India will be taking, and how Pakistan will respond to it. And in the backdrop of this, I think Pakistan remained quite vigilant, and Pakistan is forcefully coming forward in order to modernize its naval technologies and mobilize and modernize its naval forces. And of course, this Aman exercise is one part of the whole story. So I would say that that is something where we really need to focus more on developing and initiating debates as to how and why the international community did not pay attention to this sort of move. If that is the move, then are we deliberately, creating that sort of scenarios and environment in the Indo-Pacific region If this is the case, then how peace will be preserved, deterrence will be stabilized in the near future. In that case, then we are shifting and moving towards a new debate, which I just initiated somewhere, and I wrote an article that deterrence is in crisis. If deterrence is in crisis, then what would be the next move? How can we then preserve peace and avoid war? So that is sort of kind of phenomena which really need to be further investigated.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Ms. Sadia Kazmi, Director Academics at the SVI. Her question is addressed to Ambassador Zamir specifically, but other speakers may also respond if they like to. As Vipin Narang argues that India's no first use policy has far greater flexibility than generally recognized, and that India could strike first if it considers a Pakistani strike to be imminent. My question is that could this provoke Islamabad to use nuclear weapons first in an escalating conflict, rather than risk losing the option for use? Ambassador Zamir Akram.
Okay, first, I think this is not so much Vipin Narang as much as it is Shiv Shankar Menon who has said this, and Vipin Narang has used it from Menon's book Choices. So what is imminent? I think that this is not only the former Indian Foreign Secretary who said it, but if we go back to the aftermath of the 2001-2002 India-Pakistan crisis, Prime Minister Vajpayee had said very much very much the same thing, that the Pakistanis think that we are going to wait for them to use nuclear weapons, then they are mistaken. So we and Pakistan have never accepted this idea of no first use. And so this whole question from our perspective is academic. We have stated in our full spectrum deterrence doctrine very clearly that Pakistan will not allow the exercise of the so-called cold start doctrine by India to seek a conflict under the nuclear threshold. Because if there is a threat to Pakistan's security or territorial integrity, and there are various scenarios that have been already mentioned by the former SPD Director General, General Kidwai, if under those kind of situations, Pakistan security is threatened or its interests are threatened, it would be willing to use it against a conventional Indian attack. But between the point of actual use, there is a law, there is an escalatory ladder. And there are various steps in this escalatory ladder. The first step, of course, is Indian mobilization, and that cannot be hidden. Even if it is so-called cold start or proactive, we would be able to tell that such a mobilization is underway. And we would obviously then inform the Indians that if there is an attack on us, then all options are open for Pakistan. So when we say that what the Indians would say as an imminent Indian strike, we would say an imminent Indian attack. So how such a crisis would unfold as we go in a situation like that. But both sides will obviously be looking at what the other side is doing. And my guess is that better sense would prevail to the Indians from even launching a proactive or cold start type operation, as we saw in a limited sense during the February 2019 crisis. So I think that full spectrum deterrence doctrine will continue to hold and will continue to deter?
The next question is from Air Marshal Malik, Director at CAS. With Pakistan's responses to 2016 and 2019 surgical strikes in front of us, do we see a Pakistani civil military leadership's will to generate a first or second strike in case conflict compulsions demand so? He has not identified the speaker to whom the question is addressed.
May I request Ambassador Zamir to kindly ask the question?
Want me to answer this?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So it takes me back to the argument about Pakistan's nuclear doctrine. As you know, we have deliberately not enunciated an official nuclear doctrine because our doctrine is to maintain ambiguity, is to maintain strategic ambiguity. But as I mentioned to the response to the last question, a responsible person like General Kidwai, who as Director General has spoken about the scenarios under which Pakistan would use nuclear weapons, and bottom and safety, security, territorial integrity is challenged or under threat. So we are not seeking first use of nuclear weapons, but in fact, we are not seeking first use of force. That is what we are trying to do, is to convince the Indian side that instead of no first use of nuclear weapons, there should be no first use of force. And I think that, as I said before, our policy of full spectrum deterrence has so far ensured that that situation. In fact, it is actually the paralysis. I'm using the terms of a third party like Christopher Clary, who wrote in his article, India's Counterforce Temptations, that it is the paralysis on India's nuclear policy and military policy that has been imposed by full spectrum deterrence that they are looking at these counterforce options. So this paralysis, I think, is the result which has established tenuous, unstable, but still some degree of strategic stability, and which we saw again being held during these crises that you mentioned.
Abbas, can I respond?
Sure, sir.
Go ahead.
Sure. First of all, just on this strategic paralysis, interestingly, this term was written by a Pakistani author. So it was used earlier also. And,
I'm sorry, Adil, I could have given you the credit.
No. So I think I don't deserve that. It was actually Iqbal Cheema in his book. He wrote about a fourth crisis and a peace process. So he was the first one who used strategic paralysis that India faces, and I used in my writings, and then Chris also used that. But I just wanted to comment on this notion of first strike, because this is a perception that India has created or given to the rest of the world, that Pakistan probably is an irresponsible country and is developing option for a first strike. And in their own writing, the senior decision makers, as we have been discussing about Shiv Shankar Menon, in a couple of places in his book, he misuses first use and first strike, or interchangeably uses these two terms. Whereas in strategic jargon or lexicon, these two have different connotations once we are talking about deterrence. So coming back to this notion of Pakistan probably has this first strike, this is absolutely untrue. Reason, we do not have offensive doctrine against India. We have always stated that our deterrence is credible minimum deterrence. These weapons will be used as a measure of last resort if all other options fail to deter India. So that has been our policy. they talk about this low-yield weapons or the short-range ballistic missiles. Earlier, we used to term it as tactical nuclear weapons. This could be possible as a first use motion to deter or give a message to signal to the other side not to cross our threshold. So this is different from first strike. First strike in strategic jargon normally means that you attempt to destroy adversaries' entire nuclear capability of responding back. So that's a preemptive first strike that traditionally we understand. And that is where Indian planners or the decision makers, they continue to mix these two. They are unable to explain their own doctrine and they are misinterpreting Pakistan's doctrine also. And we also have to be very careful, because when we say we do not subscribe to no first use, it doesn't mean that our doctrine is a first use or a first strike. We have to be very clear there is distinction between. That's a restraint that we are demonstrating to the international community, that we do not subscribe to no first use, but it doesn't mean that we have a first use doctrine. These weapons are weapons of a last resort measures and will come into play at a certain time once our conventional options are expanded. And as Ambassador Zamir stated, gave the example of 2019. The conventional exercises that we continue to host every year, the message that comes out from there are these are conventional responses to India's so-called Gold Star doctrine or proactive operation strategy, because we have credible conventional responses to these doctrines. But to supplement that, as part of a full spectrum deterrence, we are also giving a message that in addition to conventional, because we have that conventional asymmetry with India, we are supplementing it with our nuclear capability, and that is what full spectrum deterrence is. Tactical, operational, and strategic level, the entire spectrum of threats that we are covering. So that's how we should be looking at our doctrine. We should not be mixing it, or we should not be using the phrases that India wants us to use, that in Pakistan is a first strike doctrine. That is wrong in my sense. Thank you.
Okay, Haris, there is an important question if you would like me to draw from the audience. I think Salman Shaheen raised a very pertinent and significant question on emerging technologies, AI, and the significance of some mechanisms to regulate these technologies. I think that is something very important. Globally, we see that arms control is already in crisis. And the existing arms mechanisms, which were, of course, witnessed bilaterally between US and Soviet Union, and of course now Russia, somehow were useful and set, normative notion globally to promote dialogue and debates on arms control, which itself is in crisis. But secondly, I think I would say that many of these sort of agreements that exist globally are bilaterally. For example, globally, I talk about some, conventions that deal with conventional technologies. For example, CCM cluster, convention on cluster munition, convention on certain, conventional weapons, and there is another important convention on armed forces in Europe, and plus ATT. Are the sort of important agreements that cover ground and deal with conventional technologies. So since we see that emerging technologies have huge level of interface with nuclear technologies, therefore we really need to initiate this debate at a global level as to how we can introduce new mechanisms globally, regionally, and at the bilateral level to deal with not only conventional, but also at the same time, nuclear and new technologies covering ground on artificial intelligence, cyber, and so on and so forth. So one, we need normative sort of new notions and global debates, but practical actions to initiate sort of new mechanisms and new treaties, or maybe create some more space within the existing treaties to make them more relevant to deal with the current realities. So that, again, is a gap which need to be really discussed and debated.
Aras, are there any more questions?
Sir, there are still very questions left, but we are running short of time. If you can, if you allow, I can.
Is there any question by a foreign participant?
No, sir. There is no question from any foreigner.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you can
But there,
choose. Yeah, go ahead. You want to say something?
yes, sir. There are questions from Ambassador Tajamul Altaf, Senior Research Associate at the Institute of Policy Studies. The question is addressed to Ambassador Zamir Akram. Under the given circumstances, what will be the policy of our strategic partnership with China to counter any misadventure from India? Secondly, how can we cooperate with China in this regard?
Um, I think the relationship with China is not only focused on this kind of nuclear exchange that we have with the Indians. I think the real issue is that the Chinese do not consider the Indians as equals in terms of the nuclear relationship. And so they do not wish to engage with India or with India and Pakistan at the same time. Though in the past, at our initiative, they were willing to be part of a 5+2 nation exchange, but those were more specific times, the more specific issues and different times. But in the current debate that we are engaged in today, China does not have any input as such. However, the fact is that the Indian-American strategic partnership is China-driven. It is aimed at containing and confronting China, and the buildup of India's military capabilities, both conventional and strategic, are, at least from Washington's perspective, aimed at building up India as a counterweight to China. So yes, in that context, China has an interest in seeing how the Indian strategic capability is developing. This provides Pakistan with an opportunity to enhance its military strategic cooperation with China further in areas where they can be helpful. I think in the future technologies, they can be helpful in terms of cyber, in terms of artificial intelligence, etc. They can be helpful. We already have in other ways, and other areas of military cooperation between China and Pakistan. So there are already areas in which we are engaging with the Chinese. And of course, the Chinese and the Pakistani side both have a strategic interest in the development of Indian capability between, at most, are the Indian ambition to become a member of the nuclear suppliers group with the help of the US and other Western countries. And the Chinese have taken a very clear position on that in opposing China's membership. But when we do have talks with the Chinese side, we do talk about, of course, how India is developing its strategic capabilities. But in terms of a coordinated dialogue that used to take place, say, for instance, between Pakistan and the United States, we do not have such a dialogue at the present time with either the United States or with China.
Okay, Haris. Any more questions?
There are still I think 12 questions that are unaddressed.
We can't take 12 questions. I think you can select one or two questions and then wind up.
Okay, sir.
I think I can pick
Sure,
up my
sir.
question if you like. There was a question for me from the audience. I can draw a question that someone picked, dropped for me. There was a question, I think, by and significant question by someone, Khwaja Dawood, inquiring why do you think that Pakistan lags behind and is lacking in developing a comprehensive critical technology strategy? I think 2 points are very important. One, Pakistan already, possesses comprehensive sort of its weapons program and technological program. Secondly, we need to see our capacity, resources, and priorities. And our priority is not to match bullet for bullet, but our priority is to maintain credible, minimum credible deterrence. And for that, we acquire technology which we think and believe is sufficient for us to, guarantee our survival against the adversary. So I believe that we have already acquired, sufficient technology that probably preserves our security. In the future, as I said, that yes, as Ambassador Zamir Akram highlighted, that deterrence is a dynamic term and the phenomena. But as strategic environment shifts within, our resource constraints, we will see and we would probably go for technologies which we think that we can afford and which we think can guarantee and stabilize deterrence in South Asia. So I think globally, as technology shifts take place, we cannot go into that sort of game because our sole aim is to maximize and preserve our security, not, aim is not to, build prestige at a global level or at a regional level. So I think within that framework, I think ours is a comprehensive program, but within that we are, modernizing, and our, military industrial complex is quite vigilant of what is going on around globally and regionally.
Thank you, ma'am. I think it would be last question. Ms. Anam Khan, visiting research fellow at the SVI. Through Indo-US agreements, including COMCASA, BECA, and the Quadrilateral Alliance, some scholars believe that the US will exchange 15,000 military personnel to be stationed in India, as well as Indian personnel sent to the US. How will this physical US tri-service presence in India and the IOR drastically change dynamics of any future war between India and Pakistan? She has not identified the speaker. So anyone from the panel can answer this question. Dr. Adil Sultan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think this is not the only occasion that US troops are there in India. They have been conducting exercises, and these series of agreements that the United States and India has done. Overall, the intent which is projected to the international community is that it is against China. But from a South Asian perspective, if we see, as I also mentioned in my remarks, India is going to exploit these advantages against Pakistan to assert its hegemony in the region and to assert its military superiority over Pakistan. I don't think so. United States would be interested in becoming a party to any conflict, military conflict between Pakistan and India. It doesn't suit US interest, and we are not opponents, or we are not the adversaries for now. The United States doesn't see Pakistan as a military adversary. But this is where the complications arise. As their interests converge and their military doctrines, they get intermingled, and their military capabilities interdependent, India could potentially use some of those capabilities which are being provided, or the doctrines for which the United States is training India against China, but those could be used against Pakistan. So that has been our concern, because we see United States still as our ally, and that is where we have been raising our concern to the United States, that you have all the right to do or to establish partnerships with any of the countries around the world, with India or anyone else, but don't do things that directly impedes or undermines Pakistan's security. So this BK agreement, the COMCASA, providing logistic arrangements to each other facilities, they are likely to affect adversely Pakistan's security interest, and India is likely to misuse the information gained from US satellites and the BK arrangement to have a greater in-depth view of Pakistan's mobility or the strategic asset. So that's a concern. But I don't think so. United States is going to be a direct party in any India-Pakistan conflict. We don't see United States playing any role. Thank you.
Yes. Can we have the last question?
Sure, sir. The question is from Ms. Amber Abid, Research Associate at the SVI. Does India's counterforce strategy challenges the credibility of Pakistan's nuclear posture of full spectrum deterrence? She has not identified the speaker, so anyone from the panel can address this question.
Rizwana, can you, Dr. Rizwana? Or all the three speakers can give brief remarks.
I think we have been debating this question throughout in the session today.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
You can give a very brief response.
I think first, I would just sum up in two comments and arguments by drawing, takeaways from today's discussion. One, that India's program on, counterforce is still nascent, ambitious. They have not achieved this capability yet. Secondly, yes, it has the potential and capability to, destabilize deterrence dynamics, in South Asia and to undermine Pakistan deterrent capability. But thirdly, Pakistan is vigilant on this. Pakistan has an eye on new technologies, and Pakistan is trying to and will continue to mitigate gaps that exist and that continue to exist between deterrence. And that is the key, to stabilize deterrence. So aim should be to stabilize deterrence, not to destabilize deterrence. So what we are observing here in South Asia is one country which is bigger, which has capability and has access to global technologies, instead of showing and demonstrating sense of responsibility, is trying to create space for war. That is something really, that is something really quite, different. I mean, that we have observed so far between two, adversarial, nuclear adversarial, actors. And secondly, I would say that Pakistan is trying to avoid space for war and trying to stabilize deterrence. So this needs to be recognized, and there needs to have some sort of mechanism where the whole, process should end up by towards stabilization of deterrence, to stabilize deterrence and avoid war, not to destabilize deterrence and fight war.
Okay, thank you. Adil, would you like to say something to round up?
Sir, absolutely. I think time and again I said we as students of strategic study, deterrence is a psychological phenomenon. Capabilities do affect, but in the end, it's about the perceptions of the decision makers. The problem over here is once Indian decision makers, they are given this false sense of confidence that they can be protected from incoming missiles. Such thinking, dangerous thinking of a preemptive counterforce strike could materialize against Pakistan, and especially keeping in view the mismatch amongst India's strategic enclave. Once we talk about strategic enclave, we talk about political leadership, the military, and the scientific establishment. So these are all loose areas which have the potential for a dangerous trajectory which can eventually lead to. It doesn't mean that India is going to definitely use its counterforce capability against Pakistan. Once we are talking about strategic stability, the options, capability, and the intent can change anytime. So those capabilities are destabilizing, and that is what we are discussing, that whatever India is building, it has the potential to destabilize strategic balance in the region, keeping in view the mindset amongst India's political leadership, the extremist mindset, the ignorance of their military leadership to continue exploring war-fighting doctrine, and the exuberance of their technology, the DRDO, to develop solutions for unspecified threats. So these are the problematic areas between India, Pakistan, that continues to stress strategic stability in South Asia. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Akram, do you have some concluding remarks?
I just want to say that we should be very clear, at least I am very clear, that the United States is not a neutral player or a neutral party in this Pakistan-India strategic environment. I don't want to go into details, but it's very clear that yes, the US wants to prevent, or US will be clearly involved in trying to prevent an outbreak of conflict between India and Pakistan, because they're afraid of unintended or unintentional use or accidental use of nuclear weapons, etc. All that is there. But having said that, the US for some years now, since they have tried to build up the strategic partnership with India, they have not been a neutral player, and their approach has not been equal towards India and Pakistan. It has been partisan, it has been in favor of India, and it has actually helped India to develop the kind of strategic capabilities that we are talking about today. So a large measure of the responsibility of the existing strategic instability in South Asia is a consequence of this American policy, which they have followed blindly in order to contain China, but being oblivious to the impact that this policy has had on strategic stability in South Asia. So this is something that we must, in the future, we must realize this, we must recognize this. We should not be persuaded to believe that the US is a neutral party.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we should rather apologize from people whose question could not be taken up for discussion. We have really overstepped our limited time. This has been a very useful discussion, a very comprehensive discussion. I think a very enlightened discussion on the subject. This has clarified many misgivings and many misunderstandings which exist about India's counterforce temptations. I'm really grateful to all the three distinguished panelists who found time out of their very busy schedule and made very comprehensive and very educative remarks and statements about the subject. I'm also very grateful to the participants who could find time to join us in this discussion and debate on the subject, and particularly those who have been able to ask some questions on the subject. And I once again apologize to those people whose questions I have not been able to take up. So all done, it's a very comprehensive and a very good discussion on this subject. And I'm very grateful to all the people who have made it possible. Thank you very much. Thank you, Haris. You can make concluding remarks if you want to.
Sir, thank you so much for your kind words. And thank you to all our speakers for their very comprehensive and excellent presentations on the subject. It was a very good discussion, very healthy debate. That's all from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have
Thank you very much.
a nice day.